Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we'll drift through the golden halls of Constantinople, where Rome's forgotten heir ruled for 1,000 years in splendor and shadow. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. History for sleep. Target runtime, 90 to 120 minutes. Close your eyes now, and let your body settle into this moment. Feel the weight of your head against the pillow, the gentle pull of gravity drawing you deeper into comfort. Tonight, we journey not through space, but through time itself, to a city that has stood for over 2.5 millennia, watching empires rise and fall like tides against its ancient walls. Picture, if you will, the narrow strait where Europe meets Asia. The waters here are deep blue-green, catching the last golden light of evening. This is the Bosphorus, and on its western shore rises a city of 7 hills, crowned with domes that catch the dying light like captured stars. The air carries the scent of salt and spices, the sound of gulls crying over waters that have witnessed the birth and death of empires. This is Constantinople, once called Byzantium, later known as Istanbul. But for more than 1,000 years, it was the beating heart of an empire that called itself Roman long after Rome itself had fallen to barbarian kings. Tonight, we walk through the corridors of palaces where purple-born emperors ruled over lands stretching from the Danube to the deserts of Syria, where Greek fire burned on the waters and icons glowed with beaten gold in candlelit churches. Let the weight of centuries settle around you like a warm blanket. Feel yourself drifting backward through time, past the noise of the modern world, into the quiet grandeur of Byzantium. In the year 324 of the Common Era, when the world was younger and the Roman eagle still cast its shadow across 3 continents, an emperor named Constantine stood upon a promontory overlooking the Bosphorus. The morning mist was lifting from the water, revealing the ancient Greek city of Byzantium spread across 7 hills like Rome itself. Constantine was a man who had seen the hand of God guide him to victory, who had unified an empire that seemed ready to tear itself apart, and now he dreamed of something unprecedented, a new Rome for a new age. The old Rome, that eternal city built on the banks of the Tiber, was growing heavy with the weight of its own history. Senators clung to pagan traditions while a new faith swept through the empire like spring water through drought-cracked earth. The city was magnificent still, with its forum and its Colosseum, its marble temples and its crowded insulae where the poor lived stacked like wine jars in a merchant's warehouse. But Rome was also tired. It had ruled the world for 8 centuries, and emperors had learned that ruling the world from Rome meant being perpetually thousands of miles from where the real threats emerged. Constantine breathed in the salt air and made his decision. Here, where the Golden Horn curved like a protecting arm around a natural harbor, where the hills provided natural fortifications and the strait controlled all trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, here he would build a new Rome. Not to replace the old, but to complement it, to create an eastern capital for an empire that had grown too vast for one city to govern effectively. The construction began with ceremonies that blended Christian prayer with ancient Roman ritual. Workers came from across the empire, carrying with them the skills passed down through generations. Stone masons who had learned their craft cutting marble on Greek islands found themselves shaping blocks that would become the foundation of churches. Engineers who had built Roman roads through Gallic forests now planned the great boulevards of a city that would endure long after their names were forgotten. Constantine spared no expense. The new city must rival Rome in every way, must possess all the symbols and structures that made a city truly Roman. A great hippodrome was planned, larger even than the Circus Maximus, where the people could gather to watch the races and feel themselves part of something grand. Forums and porticos, baths and basilicas, all must be built to Roman specifications but with a grandeur that would announce to the world that this was no mere provincial capital. The emperor walked the construction sites daily, his purple cloak stirring in the wind from the Bosphorus. Architects unfurled their plans on wooden tables while the sound of hammers and chisels echoed from the growing walls. Slaves and free workers labored side by side, their sweat mingling with the mortar that would hold these walls for centuries. Some of them, perhaps, caught glimpses of the future in their dreams, saw the golden domes that would one day crown this city, the mosaics that would make its churches glow like jeweled boxes in the Mediterranean sun. The heart of the new city would be its great palace, a complex of buildings and courtyards that sprawled across the southeastern promontory like a city within a city. Here the emperor would hold court, surrounded by ceremonials that borrowed from Persian kings and Roman consuls in equal measure. The throne room was designed to inspire awe, with a ceiling so high that visitors' necks would ache from craning upward, walls lined with marble that seemed to glow with inner light. But Constantine was building more than a city, he was creating the architectural foundation for a new kind of empire. This would be a Christian Rome, and so churches must be built alongside the traditional structures. The great church that would become Hagia Irene rose from its foundations, its dome an innovation that married Roman engineering with Eastern architectural dreams. Inside, artists began the work of covering walls with mosaics that caught candlelight and threw it back, transformed into something that seemed to belong more to heaven than earth. The city's walls were planned with the future in mind. Triple rows of fortifications would protect the landward approach, each wall higher than the last, creating a series of defensive lines that would make siege warfare a nightmare for any attacker. The sea walls would be lower but no less formidable, protected by the harbor chains that could close the Golden Horn to enemy ships like a golden jaw snapping shut. As the months passed and the city took shape, people began to arrive from across the empire. Merchants saw opportunity in a new capital's need for everything from bread to silk. Artisans came seeking imperial patronage, carrying their tools and their skills like precious cargo. Scholars arrived with scrolls and codices, understanding that a new city would need new libraries, new schools, new centers of learning that could rival Alexandria and Athens. The dedication ceremonies in 330 CE lasted for 40 days, a festival that combined Roman triumph with Christian thanksgiving. The emperor himself led the processions through streets that still smelled of fresh marble and new mortar. Senators and dignitaries from across the empire gathered to witness the birth of what Constantine had named after himself, Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine. Yet even as the celebrations continued, thoughtful observers might have wondered what exactly had been born here on the shores of the Bosphorus. Was this truly a new Rome, or was it something altogether different, something that would evolve in ways its founder could never have imagined? The answer would unfold across centuries, as this city became the heart of an empire that would call itself Roman while speaking Greek, that would preserve classical learning while embracing Christian mysticism, that would endure long after the Western Empire had crumbled into feudal fragments. The year is 476, and in the great palace at Ravenna, a boy emperor named Romulus Augustulus sits upon a throne that has become little more than an ornate chair in a provincial capital. The irony of his names would not be lost on poets in centuries to come: Romulus, after the legendary founder of Rome, and Augustulus, little Augustus, after the first emperor. But there was nothing imperial about this moment, nothing grand about the way an empire died. Outside the palace walls, the Gothic chieftain Odoacer waited with his warriors, men whose fathers had once served Rome as federates, allied troops fighting for Roman gold and Roman citizenship. Now they had become kingmakers, and they had decided that the fiction of Western imperial authority should end. The boy's fate was sealed not by battle but by bureaucracy, by the simple expedient of removing the symbols of office and sending them eastward to Constantinople. In the eastern capital, 300 miles across the Aegean and through the Dardanelles, Emperor Zeno received the Western imperial regalia with what we might imagine was a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. The diadem, the purple cloak, the golden eagles, all the symbols that had once represented the united majesty of Rome now rested in his treasury, making him, in theory at least, the sole Roman emperor on earth. But Zeno was no Roman in the classical sense. Born in the mountainous region of Isauria in what is now southern Turkey, he had risen through the ranks of the military with the particular ruthlessness that characterized successful men in those uncertain times. His Greek was fluent but accented, his Latin functional rather than elegant. When he spoke of Rome, he meant Constantinople, the city that had become more Roman than Rome itself while remaining thoroughly Greek in its soul. The palace scribes worked through the autumn nights of 476, preparing documents that would reshape the legal foundations of empire. From now on, all laws, all edicts, all imperial pronouncements would flow from Constantinople alone. The western provinces, those that could still be called provinces rather than barbarian kingdoms, would receive their legitimacy from the east, their governors appointed by an emperor who ruled from a city most of them had never seen. In the Hagia Irene, the great church that Constantine had built, priests offered prayers for the reunification of the empire under Eastern rule. The morning light streamed through windows of colored glass, throwing patterns of blue and gold across walls decorated with mosaics that depicted Christ as both shepherd and emperor, his eyes gazing down with a mixture of compassion and imperial majesty that seemed perfectly suited to this moment of transition. Yet even as the forms of legal continuity were preserved, everyone understood that something fundamental had changed. The western provinces were now ruled by Gothic and Vandal kings who maintained the fiction of governing in the emperor's name while exercising completely independent power. Theodoric the Great, who had established his capital at Ravenna, surrounded himself with the ceremonies of Roman administration while his warriors lounged in villas that had once belonged to senatorial families. In Gaul, Clovis was building what would become the Frankish kingdom, his victories blessed by Catholic bishops who saw in him a defender of Orthodox Christianity against Arian heretics. In North Africa, Vandal kings ruled from Carthage with a casual brutality that made Roman taxation seem gentle by comparison. Spain had become a Visigothic kingdom where Roman law competed with Germanic custom in courts presided over by kings who could barely read Latin. The Eastern court adapted to its new role with the flexibility that would become one of Byzantium's defining characteristics. If the West was lost to barbarian kingdoms, then the East would become more thoroughly Roman than ever, more consciously the heir to Caesar and Augustus. Court ceremonies became more elaborate, more intentionally awe-inspiring. The emperor was no longer merely the first citizen of the Republic, as Augustus had styled himself, but the vicegerent of God on earth, ruling by divine appointment over an empire that stretched from the Danube to the cataracts of the Nile. This transformation was not merely political but spiritual. The Eastern Empire was becoming something new, though its inhabitants would never have admitted it. They were Romans, they insisted, the only true Romans left in a world where barbarians wore the purple in the West. Their language might be Greek, their customs increasingly Eastern, their theology shaped by debates that would have seemed alien to Marcus Aurelius or Trajan, but they were Romans nonetheless. In the palace workshops, artisans were creating objects that embodied this new imperial identity. Ivory diptychs carved with images of emperors showed rulers who looked more like Byzantine saints than classical Caesars. Their eyes were large and luminous, gazing upward toward heaven rather than outward toward earthly dominion. Their robes were heavy with jewels and gold thread, speaking of wealth beyond measure but also of a kind of sacred isolation from the world they ruled. The Senate of Constantinople, unlike its Western counterpart, was becoming more rather than less important during this period. As the Western senatorial class disappeared into obscurity or barbarian service, the Eastern senators found themselves the guardians of Roman legal tradition, the keepers of classical learning, the bridge between the empire's pagan past and its Christian future. In the law schools of Beirut, students still learned the principles that Ulpian and Papinian had established centuries before. But they learned them in Greek now, and they applied them to problems that would have been unimaginable to classical jurists. How should Christian marriage law interact with Roman property rights? What were the legal obligations of monasteries? How should the state regulate religious art and architecture? These questions might seem arcane to us, but they shaped daily life in ways that touched every inhabitant of the Eastern Empire. A merchant traveling from Alexandria to Thessalonica knew that he traveled through territories governed by a single legal system, protected by laws that descended in unbroken succession from the 12 tables of the early Republic. The forms had evolved, the language had changed, but the essential continuity remained. As the 5th century drew to a close, the Eastern Empire was becoming something unprecedented in human history, a state that was simultaneously ancient and innovative, traditional and adaptable, Roman and Greek and Christian all at once. The transformation was not complete, it would take centuries more to reach full maturity, but already, in the streets of Constantinople and the provinces beyond, a new kind of civilization was emerging from the marriage of Roman administration, Greek culture, and Christian faith. In the year 527, when the purple imperial boots were first laced upon the feet of Justinian, few could have imagined that this provincial Latin speaker from the mountains of Illyria would attempt to reconquer the world. He was not an impressive figure physically, contemporary sources describe him as short and stocky, with a round face that could look either cherubic or ruthlessly determined depending upon his mood. But behind those unremarkable features burned an ambition that would reshape the Mediterranean world and leave monuments that still inspire awe 15 centuries later. Justinian had been raised in the palace of his uncle Justin, a peasant soldier who had risen through the ranks to become emperor through a combination of luck, ability, and the kind of political cunning that was essential for survival in 6th century Constantinople. The young man had received the finest education available, studying rhetoric and theology, law and philosophy, but it was his uncle's practical lessons in statecraft that truly shaped his imperial vision. From the windows of the great palace, Justinian could look across the Bosphorus toward the hills of Asia, but his dreams reached much further. To the west lay Italy, where Gothic kings ruled from Ravenna while claiming to govern in the emperor's name. Beyond Italy lay Africa, where Vandal pirates had created a kingdom built on plunder and religious persecution. Further still lay Spain, lost to the Visigoths, and Gaul, where Frankish warriors were carving out kingdoms from the ruins of Roman administration. All of this, Justinian believed, was rightfully his. He was the heir of Augustus and Trajan, Constantine and Theodosius, and it was his sacred duty to restore the empire to its ancient boundaries. The barbarian kingdoms might seem powerful, but they were founded on conquest rather than law, held together by personal loyalty rather than institutional continuity. They could be broken by an emperor who possessed both the will to act and the resources to sustain a campaign of reconquest. The resources, Justinian believed, were within his grasp. The eastern provinces were prosperous as they had not been for centuries. Egyptian grain ships still sailed regularly to Constantinople, their holds heavy with wheat that fed the capital's 500,000 inhabitants. Syrian merchants carried silk and spices along roads that were maintained and protected by imperial troops. The cities of Asia Minor hummed with workshops where artisans produced goods that were prized from Britain to India. More importantly, the Eastern Empire possessed something the barbarian kingdoms lacked: institutional stability. When a Vandal or Gothic king died, succession often meant civil war, brothers fighting brothers while their kingdoms bled away their strength. But the Eastern Empire had developed mechanisms for orderly succession, legal frameworks that could survive even incompetent rulers, administrative systems that functioned regardless of who occupied the throne. Justinian's first great project was not military but legal: the codification of Roman law into what would become known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. For 3 years, teams of legal scholars worked in rooms above the Great Palace, surrounded by scrolls and codices that contained 1,000 years of legal precedent. They were led by Tribonian, a brilliant jurist who could recite vast sections of classical legal texts from memory, his mind a living library of Roman jurisprudence. The work was staggering in its scope. Roman law had grown like a vast, sprawling city over the centuries, with new additions grafted onto old foundations, contradictory statutes competing with ancient precedents, imperial edicts that modified or negated earlier decisions. What emerged from Tribonian's workshops was something far more systematic: a clear, organized statement of legal principles that could be applied throughout the empire and perhaps, Justinian hoped, throughout the reconquered territories as well. While the lawyers labored over their manuscripts, Justinian was also planning campaigns that would require the empire's military and financial resources to their utmost. His first target would be the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, ruled by Gelimer, a king whose persecution of Orthodox Christians had provided Justinian with both a moral justification for war and a promise of support from the local population. The man chosen to lead this expedition was Belisarius, a general who had already proven his worth in wars against the Persians along the empire's eastern frontier. Belisarius was still a young man, not yet 35, but he possessed that rare combination of personal courage and strategic insight that made great commanders. His soldiers trusted him completely, following him into battles where victory often seemed impossible until his tactical brilliance turned apparent defeat into crushing triumph. The preparations for the African expedition revealed the wealth and organizational capacity that the Eastern Empire could bring to bear when its resources were properly marshaled. Shipwrights worked through the summer months of 533, building the transport vessels that would carry 15,000 soldiers across waters that had been dominated by Vandal pirates for a century. Quartermasters calculated supplies with mathematical precision: so much grain for so many men for so many days, replacement weapons for losses in battle, medical supplies for the wounded. The Empress Theodora watched these preparations with what we might imagine was a mixture of pride and anxiety. She had been an actress before her marriage to Justinian, a woman from the lower classes who had risen through beauty and intelligence to share the throne of the Eastern Empire. Her own rise had taught her that fortune could change quickly, that ambitious plans could founder on unexpected obstacles, that even emperors were subject to forces beyond their control. But Theodora also understood that great achievements required great risks. The Eastern Empire could remain secure behind its walls and its fleet, collecting taxes from prosperous provinces while barbarian kingdoms squabbled over the western territories. Or it could reach for something greater, could attempt to restore the universal empire that had once brought peace and order to the entire Mediterranean world. When Belisarius sailed from Constantinople in June 533, his fleet carried more than soldiers and supplies. it carried Justinian's vision of imperial restoration, his dream of an empire that would stretch once again from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. The outcome of this expedition would determine not only the fate of North Africa but the future of the Eastern Empire itself, testing whether Byzantine resources and Roman determination could overcome the barbarian kingdoms that had seemed so permanently established in the former western provinces. The North African sun beat down mercilessly upon the beaches near Hadramedum as 15,000 Byzantine soldiers waded ashore in the late summer of 533. Belisarius stood in the prow of the leading galley, his hand shading his eyes as he surveyed the coastline that would either make his reputation or destroy it utterly. The water was the impossibly deep blue of the Mediterranean at its most beautiful, but the general's mind was focused on more practical matters: the disposition of enemy forces, the loyalty of the local population, the thousand details of logistics that would determine whether this ambitious expedition would succeed or join the long catalogue of imperial disasters. The Vandal kingdom that awaited him had grown complacent during its century of dominance over the western Mediterranean. King Gelimer ruled from Carthage, that ancient rival of Rome which had been rebuilt as the capital of a maritime empire built on piracy and religious persecution. The Vandal fleet that had once terrorized Roman shipping had grown lazy and undisciplined, their crews more interested in counting their shares of plunder than maintaining their fighting edge. More importantly for Belisarius's plans, the local population remained largely Roman in culture and Catholic in religion. The Vandals were Arians, followers of a Christian theology that the Orthodox considered heretical, and they had persecuted the local bishops with a cruelty that had earned them the hatred of their subjects. When Byzantine ships appeared on the horizon flying the imperial eagle, many North Africans saw liberation rather than conquest. The first engagement came at Ad Decimum, 10 miles from Carthage, where Gelimer had assembled his forces for what he expected would be a decisive victory over the eastern invaders. The Vandal king possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and knew the terrain intimately, advantages that should have guaranteed success against an enemy fighting far from their bases of supply. But Gelimer had never faced an opponent like Belisarius, had never encountered the disciplined tactical flexibility that the Eastern Empire had learned from decades of warfare against the Persians. Belisarius divided his forces in a maneuver that appeared suicidally reckless but proved devastatingly effective. While his infantry advanced along the main road toward Carthage, his cavalry swept around the Vandal flanks in a movement so rapid and unexpected that Gelimer's scouts barely had time to report the threat before Byzantine horses were among them. The battle lasted less than 3 hours, but its outcome determined the fate of North Africa. The pursuit after Ad Decimum was relentless. Vandal resistance collapsed not through lack of courage but through the sudden realization that their century of dominance was ending. Tribal chieftains who had served the Vandal kings for generations began sending messengers to Belisarius, offering submission to an emperor most of them had never seen but whose representatives had just demonstrated the superior organization and fighting quality of the Eastern Empire. Carthage fell without a siege. The great city that Cato had once demanded must be destroyed, that Scipio had actually destroyed, that the Romans had rebuilt as the capital of the province of Africa, opened its gates to welcome Belisarius as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The general's first act was to restore the Catholic bishops to their churches, a gesture that won him the enthusiastic support of the urban population and demonstrated that this conquest was about restoration rather than exploitation. The wealth that fell into Byzantine hands was staggering. The Vandal royal treasury contained not only the plunder of a century of piracy but artifacts of immense historical significance, golden vessels that had been looted from the Temple of Jerusalem by Titus, imperial regalia that the Vandals had carried off when they sacked Rome in 455, jewelry and precious objects that represented the accumulated wealth of the western Mediterranean. But Belisarius understood that military victory was only the beginning of the reconquest. The real challenge lay in transforming a barbarian kingdom back into a Roman province, in re-establishing the administrative systems and legal frameworks that could integrate North Africa into the Eastern Empire's governmental structure. This required a different kind of skill from battlefield command, a talent for organization and diplomacy that few generals possessed. Working with unprecedented speed, Belisarius began the reconstruction of Roman Africa. Tax collectors were appointed from among the local population, men who understood both the resources of their regions and the expectations of imperial administration. The legal system was re-established according to the principles set down in Justinian's new law codes, providing both continuity with ancient practice and adaptation to current circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, Belisarius maintained strict discipline among his troops, preventing the kind of looting and violence that had characterized barbarian conquests. His soldiers were paid regularly from the captured Vandal treasury, removing the incentive for private plunder that had made so many armies unwelcome even among populations that had initially supported them. This discipline transformed the Byzantines from conquerors into liberators in the eyes of many North Africans. The success in Africa electrified the Eastern Empire and terrified the barbarian kingdoms that still controlled former Roman territories. In Constantinople, Justinian received the news of Carthage's fall with a satisfaction that must have felt like vindication of his entire imperial vision. Here was proof that the barbarian kingdoms were not permanent fixtures of the post-Roman world, that superior organization and determination could restore the empire to its ancient boundaries. In Ravenna, Theodoric's Gothic successors watched the North African campaign with growing alarm. If the Byzantines could destroy the Vandal kingdom so quickly and completely, what hope did any barbarian realm have against imperial determination backed by superior resources? The Gothic hold on Italy, which had seemed unshakable just months before, now appeared suddenly precarious. The triumph that Justinian celebrated in Constantinople when the Vandal treasure arrived was consciously modeled on the great imperial triumphs of antiquity. Belisarius rode through the streets of the capital while crowds cheered and threw flowers, the captured Vandal king Gelimer walking in chains behind the general's chariot in a scene that recalled the victories of Scipio and Caesar, Trajan and Aurelian. But even as the celebrations continued, Justinian was already planning the next phase of his reconquest. Italy lay across the Adriatic, rich and strategically crucial, still governed by Gothic kings who claimed to rule in the emperor's name while exercising completely independent authority. If North Africa could be restored to the empire, why not Italy? Why not, ultimately, the entire western Mediterranean world that had once bowed to Roman eagles? The Italian peninsula in the year 535 was a land of contrasts that would have been both familiar and alien to a Roman of earlier centuries. The great cities still stood, Rome itself, with its ancient forums and basilicas, Milan with its thriving commercial quarters, Ravenna with its magnificent churches decorated in the Eastern style. But the countryside had changed dramatically, vast estates worked by semi-free coloni who owed service to Gothic warriors rather than Roman landlords, and in the cities themselves, Arian churches competed with Catholic basilicas for the devotion of a population that remained predominantly Roman in culture despite decades of barbarian rule. Theodoric the Great had died in 526, leaving behind a kingdom that seemed stable and prosperous but which faced the same succession crisis that plagued all barbarian realms founded on personal rather than institutional authority. His daughter Amalasuntha served as regent for his young grandson Athalaric, attempting to maintain the delicate balance between Gothic military traditions and Roman administrative sophistication that had made her father's reign successful. But the Gothic nobles grew restless under feminine rule, particularly rule that seemed to favor Roman customs and Catholic theology over the Arian faith and warrior traditions that defined Gothic identity. When Athalaric died in 534, still a teenager, Amalasuntha found herself isolated between Gothic nobles who resented her pro-Roman policies and a Roman population that, however much they might prefer her to her alternatives, could never fully trust a barbarian ruler. Justinian watched these developments with the keen interest of a chess player seeing his opponent's pieces fall into vulnerable positions. The succession crisis provided exactly the kind of pretext for intervention that Roman emperors had always sought when preparing to expand their territories. Better still, Amalasuntha herself had opened negotiations with Constantinople, seeking imperial support against her domestic enemies in return for concessions that would effectively make Italy a Byzantine protectorate. The murder of Amalasuntha in 535 by her cousin and co-ruler Theodahad provided Justinian with the perfect excuse for invasion. Here was a crime that violated both natural law and the diplomatic agreements between the Gothic kingdom and the empire, committed by a usurper whose legitimacy could be challenged on both legal and moral grounds. More practically, it suggested that the Gothic kingdom was entering a period of internal weakness that would make conquest easier. Belisarius, fresh from his triumph in North Africa, received orders to prepare for a campaign that would dwarf even his African achievements. Italy was far larger than the Vandal kingdom, its Gothic rulers more numerous and better organized than Gelimer had been, and the terrain far more challenging for an invading army. Mountains and marshes, fortified cities and hostile populations would test every aspect of Byzantine military capability. The initial landing in Sicily proceeded with almost suspicious ease. The island's Gothic garrison was small and demoralized, and the local population welcomed the Byzantines with the same enthusiasm that North Africans had shown. Within months, Sicily was back under imperial control, providing Belisarius with a secure base for the invasion of the Italian mainland and demonstrating once again that Gothic rule was more fragile than it appeared. The crossing to the mainland revealed the scale of the challenge that awaited the Byzantine forces. Italy was not North Africa, where a single decisive victory could shatter barbarian resistance. The Gothic kingdom possessed multiple centers of power, fortified cities that could withstand siege, and a warrior aristocracy that had every reason to fight desperately rather than surrender their lands and privileges to Eastern administrators. Naples fell after a siege that cost both sides heavily, its walls breached only through the kind of engineering skill that recalled the great sieges of classical antiquity. Roman siege engines hurled stones against fortifications built by Roman architects, while inside the city, Gothic defenders and Roman civilians endured the hunger and disease that made siege warfare a horror for non-combatants as well as soldiers. The capture of Naples opened the road to Rome itself, the eternal city that remained the symbolic heart of the empire even though real power had long since shifted eastward. When Belisarius entered Rome in December 536, he found a city that was both magnificent and melancholy, its ancient monuments still impressive but its population reduced to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, a tenth of what it had been at the height of imperial power. The Roman populace greeted their liberators with carefully controlled enthusiasm. These were people who had survived the sack of Alaric and the capture by Genseric, who had learned to accommodate themselves to Gothic rule while maintaining their Roman identity. They understood that supporting the wrong side in this conflict could mean death or exile, but they also remembered stories their grandparents had told of the time when Roman emperors ruled from the Seven Hills. Vitiges, who had succeeded Theodahad as Gothic king, responded to the loss of Rome with a strategy that revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of barbarian kingship. Rather than accept the loss of Italy's symbolic capital, he assembled the largest Gothic army in a generation and marched south to besiege Rome itself, betting everything on a single massive effort to crush Byzantine resistance before it could consolidate. The siege of Rome that followed was one of the great military dramas of late antiquity, pitting Gothic numbers and determination against Byzantine discipline and engineering skill. For more than a year, the two armies faced each other across the walls that Aurelian had built in the 3rd century, walls that had protected Rome from barbarian invasions but now sheltered Byzantine defenders against Gothic besiegers. Belisarius proved himself not only a field commander but a master of defensive warfare. His engineers strengthened the ancient walls where necessary, his archers dominated the approaches to the city, and his cavalry sorties disrupted Gothic supply lines while maintaining communication with the Byzantine fleet that controlled the mouth of the Tiber. Most importantly, he kept the morale of both his soldiers and the Roman population high during the long months when the outcome remained in doubt. The Gothic withdrawal from Rome in 538 marked the beginning of the end for barbarian rule in Italy, but it was only the beginning of a war that would drag on for years and consume resources that the Eastern Empire could ill afford. Justinian had achieved his goal of restoring Italy to imperial rule, but the cost was becoming apparent not only in gold and soldiers but in the strain placed on other frontiers where Persian and barbarian pressure continued to threaten the empire's eastern and northern boundaries. In the cold January of 532, Constantinople awakened to what seemed like an ordinary day of chariot racing in the great hippodrome that dominated the city's social and political life. The morning mist was lifting from the Golden Horn, revealing the domes and porticos of a city that had grown rich on the trade routes between Europe and Asia, between the grain fields of Egypt and the silk markets of China. Citizens wrapped in their cloaks hurried through streets still slick with winter rain, eager to reach the hippodrome where the blues and greens would compete in races that meant far more than simple entertainment. The chariot factions of Constantinople were not merely sporting clubs but political organizations that channeled the urban population's loyalties and grievances into contests that could erupt into violence at any moment. The blues generally supported the imperial government and orthodox theology, while the greens tended toward opposition and were often suspected of harboring Monophysite sympathies. On this particular day, tensions between the factions and the government had reached a breaking point that would test whether Justinian possessed the courage necessary to hold his throne. The emperor sat in the kathisma, the imperial box that connected the hippodrome directly to the great palace, allowing him to appear before his subjects while remaining protected by the ceremonial distance that surrounded the person of a Roman emperor. Theodora was beside him, her dark eyes surveying the crowd with the instincts of someone who had once performed before similar audiences and understood their moods better than most aristocrats could comprehend. The races began normally enough, with the usual cheers and curses that accompanied the thundering hooves and spinning wheels of the chariots as they rounded the spina that ran down the center of the track. But gradually, the crowd's attention shifted from the races to politics, from sporting rivalry to more serious grievances against imperial policies that had increased taxes while restricting the traditional privileges of the factions. Nika! Nika! The cry began in one section of the crowd and spread like fire through dry grass until the entire hippodrome echoed with the word that meant victory, but which had become a rallying cry for opposition to Justinian's rule. What made this moment so dangerous was that both blues and greens had joined in the chanting, setting aside their traditional rivalry to unite against the imperial government in a coalition that represented nearly the entire urban population of the capital. Justinian's initial response revealed both his inexperience and his fatal tendency to underestimate the seriousness of popular discontent. Rather than addressing the crowd's grievances or attempting to divide the factions against each other, he simply left the hippodrome, apparently believing that the demonstration would exhaust itself if ignored. This withdrawal was interpreted by the crowd as a sign of weakness, and what had begun as a political demonstration quickly escalated into open rebellion. By evening, the streets of Constantinople were in the hands of the mob. Fires burned throughout the city as rioters attacked symbols of imperial authority, the prefect's residence, the offices of tax collectors, the barracks of units loyal to the government. The great church of Hagia Sophia, which Constantine had built as a symbol of the Christian Empire, was set ablaze by crowds who blamed the clergy for supporting unpopular imperial policies. From the windows of the great palace, Justinian could see the flames rising above the city he was supposed to rule, could hear the roar of crowds that were demanding not reform but his abdication and exile. His advisors were divided between those who counseled flight and those who urged negotiations with the rebels, but none had any clear idea of how to restore imperial authority over a capital city that seemed to have slipped completely beyond governmental control. The rebellion gained political focus when the crowds proclaimed Hypatius, a nephew of the former emperor Anastasius, as their new emperor. Hypatius was a reluctant revolutionary who had little desire for power but found himself swept along by events beyond his control. His proclamation gave the rioters a legitimate focus for their opposition to Justinian and transformed what had been mob violence into something approaching a genuine civil war. For 5 days, Constantinople remained in rebel hands while Justinian vacillated between fight and flight. His generals urged him to abandon the capital and establish himself in one of the provincial cities where loyal troops could be gathered for a campaign to retake Constantinople. His advisors calculated the chances of successful escape across the Bosphorus to the safety of Asia Minor, where imperial authority remained intact. It was Theodora who provided the courage and clarity that the situation demanded. In words that have echoed through the centuries as an example of imperial dignity under pressure, she declared that she would rather die wearing the purple than live in exile without it. The empire, she argued, was worth the risk of death, and an emperor who fled from his capital would never be respected by his subjects or his enemies. Her speech shamed Justinian into decisive action, but it was the tactical brilliance of Belisarius and Mundus that saved the dynasty and the empire. The two generals had remained loyal throughout the crisis, and they possessed the military skill necessary to turn popular rebellion into a tactical problem that could be solved through the application of disciplined force. The final act of the Nika riots took place in the hippodrome itself, where the rebels had gathered to witness the coronation of Hypatius as their new emperor. Belisarius entered through one gate while Mundus entered through another, trapping the crowd in an enclosure that had been designed for entertainment but which now became a killing ground. The massacre that followed was thorough and merciless. Contemporary sources suggest that 30,000 people died in the space of a few hours. The suppression of the Nika riots marked a turning point in Justinian's reign and in the character of the Eastern Empire itself. The emperor had learned that popular support could not be taken for granted, that even a legitimate ruler needed the instruments of coercion to maintain authority in a city as large and politically sophisticated as Constantinople. More broadly, the riots demonstrated both the fragility and the resilience of imperial institutions in an age when personal loyalty often mattered more than legal continuity. The reconstruction of Constantinople after the riots provided Justinian with an opportunity to reshape his capital according to his own vision of imperial grandeur. The burned buildings were replaced with structures that were larger and more magnificent than their predecessors, while the new Hagia Sophia that rose from the ashes of the old church became a monument to both divine providence and imperial determination that would inspire awe for 1,000 years. In the months following the Nika riots, as workmen cleared away the charred ruins of the old Hagia Sophia, Justinian walked among the debris with a vision that must have seemed impossible to those who witnessed the emperor contemplating the blackened stones and collapsed walls. The church that Constantine had built, enlarged by his successors, and destroyed by rioters would be replaced not merely by a larger building but by something unprecedented in human history, a structure that would marry Roman engineering with Eastern mysticism to create a space that seemed to belong more to heaven than to earth. The architects chosen for this unprecedented project were Anthemius of Tralles and Isidorus of Miletus, men whose genius lay not in following established patterns but in imagining solutions to problems that had never before been attempted. Anthemius was both a mathematician and a practical engineer, a man who understood how theoretical geometry could be translated into stone and mortar. Isidorus brought to the partnership a mystical sense of space and light that would transform mathematical precision into spiritual experience. Together, they conceived a building that would challenge every assumption about what was possible in architecture. The central dome would span a space so vast that visitors would feel dizzy looking up at its golden ceiling, yet it would seem to float without visible support, suspended between heaven and earth like the firmament itself. The engineering required to achieve this effect would push Roman building techniques beyond their traditional limits and create innovations that would influence architecture for centuries to come. The construction began in February 532, less than a month after the riots had ended, with ceremonies that blended Christian prayer with the ancient Roman rituals that attended the founding of great public works. Justinian himself laid the cornerstone, his hands touching marble that had been quarried on the islands of the Aegean and carried to Constantinople by ships whose holds were blessed by priests before they sailed from distant ports. The scale of the project demanded resources from across the empire and beyond. Marble came from quarries that had supplied the Parthenon and the palaces of Roman emperors, their veins and colors chosen not merely for beauty but for symbolic meaning. Green marble from Thessaly would represent the earth, while white marble from the islands would suggest the purity of divine light. Red porphyry, reserved for imperial use, would accent columns and panels that proclaimed the sacred nature of imperial authority. But it was not merely the materials that made Hagia Sophia extraordinary, it was the unprecedented use of space that the architects achieved through innovations that seemed to defy the laws of physics as they were then understood. The Great Dome, 180 feet above the floor and 112 feet in diameter, was supported not by massive walls that would have made the interior dark and oppressive but by pendentives, curved triangular sections that distributed the dome's weight to four great piers while leaving the sides open for windows that would flood the interior with light. The workforce that assembled to build this marvel was as international as the empire itself. Master masons came from Greece and Asia Minor, their skills passed down through generations that had built temples and basilicas across the eastern Mediterranean. Sculptors arrived from Egypt and Syria, carrying with them techniques for working marble that had been perfected in workshops that had served pharaohs and Caesars alike. The mosaic artists who would eventually decorate the interior began their work while the walls were still rising, creating in their workshops the millions of tiny glass and gold tesserae that would eventually transform the church's surfaces into shimmering fields of color and light. Each tessera was cut by hand to exact specifications, its angle and placement calculated to catch and reflect the candlelight that would illuminate the church during the liturgies that would make this building the spiritual heart of the empire. As the months passed and the walls rose toward heaven, Constantinople watched the construction with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Never before had so much of the empire's wealth been concentrated in a single building project, never had so many skilled craftsmen been gathered in one place for so ambitious an undertaking. If the project succeeded, it would demonstrate that the Eastern Empire possessed resources and capabilities that far exceeded those of any barbarian kingdom. If it failed, the emperor's prestige might never recover from the humiliation. The technical challenges seemed to multiply as the building approached its full height. The Great Dome, which had looked so elegant in the architect's drawings, proved almost impossibly difficult to construct in reality. Temporary wooden centering was required to support the masonry until the mortar had set, but the centering itself had to be engineered with unprecedented precision to bear the weight without collapsing. The first attempt to complete the dome ended in partial failure when earthquakes damaged the centering before the masonry had fully hardened. Cracks appeared in the great arches that supported the dome, and for terrifying weeks it seemed possible that the entire structure might collapse, taking with it not only the largest sum of money ever spent on a single building but Justinian's reputation as a ruler capable of achieving the impossible. But the architects proved as resourceful in solving problems as they had been innovative in creating them. The dome was reinforced with techniques borrowed from military engineering, its weight redistributed through a system of buttresses and counterarches that were hidden within the building's walls. The cracks were repaired with a mortar that proved stronger than the original masonry, and construction proceeded with even greater care and precision. On December 27, 537, less than 6 years after construction had begun, Justinian entered the completed Hagia Sophia for the first time. Contemporary sources describe his reaction in terms that suggest overwhelming emotional impact. The emperor is said to have stood silent for long minutes, his eyes moving upward from the marble floors to the golden dome that seemed to float weightlessly above the vast interior space. Solomon, I have surpassed thee, he is reported to have said, comparing his achievement to the Temple of Jerusalem that had been the wonder of the ancient world. But Hagia Sophia was more than an architectural triumph, it was a statement about the nature of imperial power and divine authority, a building that would serve as the coronation church of emperors and the spiritual center of Orthodox Christianity for nearly 1,000 years, until the day when Ottoman cannons would batter down the walls of Constantinople and transform the great church into a mosque. The ships arrived in Constantinople's harbor in the late spring of 541, their holds heavy with grain from the fertile fields of Egypt, their crews tired but healthy after the voyage across the eastern Mediterranean. No one who watched them dock at the great harbor installations of the Golden Horn could have imagined that they carried with them something far more deadly than pirates or barbarian armies, a disease that would kill more people than all of Justinian's wars combined and bring the Eastern Empire to the very brink of collapse. The plague had begun its journey in the trading ports of the Red Sea, where merchants from India and Ethiopia exchanged goods in markets that brought together products from across the known world. Rats carrying infected fleas had boarded grain ships bound for Alexandria, and from Alexandria the disease had spread along the trade routes that connected the Roman world. The same routes that had brought prosperity to the eastern provinces now became highways for death. The first cases in Constantinople appeared among the dock workers and grain merchants who handled cargo from Egypt, men who developed high fevers and painful swellings in their necks and armpits before dying in agony within days of falling ill. The imperial physicians, trained in the medical traditions that descended from Galen and Hippocrates, had no understanding of what they faced. Their treatments, bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayers and incantations, proved utterly useless against a disease that killed without regard for social status, medical knowledge, or religious devotion. Within weeks, the plague had spread throughout the capital, carried not only by the rats and fleas that were its true vectors but by the human commerce that made Constantinople the greatest trading city of the Mediterranean world. Merchants carried it to Thessalonica and Athens, soldiers spread it along the military roads that connected the capital to the frontier fortresses, administrators brought it to the provincial cities where they conducted the empire's business. Procopius, who served as Justinian's court historian and witnessed the plague's impact firsthand, left a description that still has the power to horrify readers 15 centuries later. He wrote of bodies lying unburied in the streets because there were not enough living people to dispose of the dead, of entire neighborhoods that became silent as death claimed every inhabitant, of ships that drifted unmanned in the harbor because their crews had perished before they could reach port. The social order that held the empire together began to break down as the death toll mounted. Tax collectors abandoned their posts rather than venture into plague-stricken districts, soldiers deserted their units to care for dying families, and imperial administrators fled the capital for country estates where they hoped the disease might not follow. The careful bureaucratic systems that made the Eastern Empire function effectively proved helpless against a catastrophe that recognized no administrative boundaries. In the Great Palace, Justinian himself fell victim to the plague, developing the characteristic buboes that marked the disease's onset. For days, the emperor lay between life and death while his courtiers whispered about succession and his enemies throughout the empire prepared to take advantage of what seemed like inevitable imperial collapse. Theodora maintained the appearance of normal governance, issuing edicts in her husband's name while privately preparing for the possibility that she might have to rule alone. The plague's impact on the empire's military capabilities was devastating. Entire regiments were wiped out not in battle but in their barracks, while recruitment became impossible in provinces where the surviving population was struggling merely to bury their dead. The Italian War, which had been going well under Belisarius's leadership, ground to a halt as reinforcements failed to arrive and existing units melted away through disease and desertion. Even more ominous for the empire's long-term prospects was the plague's impact on the tax base that funded imperial ambitions. Egypt, which had supplied Constantinople with both grain and gold for centuries, saw its population reduced by perhaps a third, its irrigated fields returning to desert as there were no longer enough farmers to maintain the ancient systems that made the Nile Valley productive. Syria and Asia Minor suffered similar devastation, their prosperous cities becoming half-empty ruins watched over by skeletal populations of survivors. The religious implications of the plague created a crisis of faith that shook the foundations of Christian society. If God favored the Christian empire, as imperial propaganda had always insisted, why had he permitted such devastation to fall upon his faithful subjects? Some bishops proclaimed the plague a punishment for sin, calling for greater piety and more generous donations to the church. Others saw it as a test of faith that would strengthen those who survived. But for many ordinary citizens, the plague seemed to demonstrate either divine indifference or divine wrath, and traditional religious observances began to seem inadequate to the magnitude of the catastrophe. Mystery cults that promised protection against disease gained followers, while magical practices that had been suppressed by Christian emperors began to reappear as desperate people sought any remedy that might preserve their lives or the lives of their families. The emperor's recovery in late 542 was seen by many as miraculous, a sign that divine providence had preserved him to lead the empire through its darkest hour. But the Justinian who emerged from his sickbed was a changed man, more conscious of his own mortality and more aware of the limits that circumstances could place on even imperial ambitions. The grand dreams of universal reconquest that had driven his early reign would have to be scaled back to accommodate the harsh realities imposed by demographic and economic collapse. Slowly, painfully, the empire began the long process of recovery from the plague's devastation. Survivors inherited the property of the dead, creating new concentrations of wealth that helped rebuild the tax base. Abandoned lands were resettled by immigrants from less affected regions, while government policies encouraged marriage and childbearing to restore population levels. The plague itself gradually burned out as it ran out of susceptible victims, but its effects would shape the empire's development for centuries to come. By 545, the worst of the crisis had passed, but the Eastern Empire that emerged from the plague was smaller and poorer than the one that had entered it. Justinian's dreams of restoring the universal Roman Empire would never be completely abandoned, but they would have to be pursued with reduced resources and a diminished population, against enemies who had learned that even the Eastern Empire was not invincible. Along the windswept hills of northern Mesopotamia, where the headwaters of the Tigris cut their ancient path toward the distant sea, two empires faced each other across a frontier that had remained essentially unchanged for 3 centuries. To the west lay the Roman provinces of Syria and Asia Minor, their cities protected by walls built with the engineering skill that had made Roman armies masters of the known world. To the east stretched the Persian Empire of the Sassanids, heir to Cyrus and Darius, ruled from Ctesiphon by kings who claimed dominion over all lands from the Oxus to the Euphrates. This was the most dangerous frontier in the world, where Christianity faced Zoroastrianism, where Roman law met Persian custom, where two civilizations that considered themselves universal empires disputed control over the trade routes that connected Europe to India and China. The wars that periodically erupted along this frontier were not mere territorial disputes but conflicts between worldviews, struggles for supremacy between powers that could not conceive of sharing the world with equals. Khosrow I, who ruled Persia from 531 to 579, was perhaps the most formidable opponent that any Roman emperor would face during the 6th century. Known to his subjects as Anushirvan, the immortal soul, he combined military genius with administrative skill, strategic patience with tactical boldness. His court at Ctesiphon rivaled Constantinople in its magnificence, while his armies possessed discipline and equipment that made them more than equal to Roman legions in open battle. The renewed war that began in 540 caught Justinian at the worst possible moment, with his armies committed to the reconquest of Italy and his treasury strained by the massive expenses of his building programs. Khosrow's invasion of Syria was timed to exploit these weaknesses, and the Persian advance demonstrated that the Eastern Empire's military superiority was far from absolute when facing enemies who possessed comparable resources and organization. Antioch, the great city that served as Rome's eastern capital, fell to Persian assault in 540 after a siege that revealed the devastating effectiveness of Sassanid military engineering. The city's walls, which had protected it through centuries of warfare, crumbled under the impact of siege engines that incorporated innovations borrowed from both Roman and Persian traditions. When the city finally fell, Khosrow ordered its entire population deported to Persia, a massive forced migration that demonstrated both Persian ruthlessness and the empire's capacity for long-term planning. The deportees from Antioch were settled in a new city near Ctesiphon, built to exact specifications that replicated their lost home's layout and architecture. This better than Antioch, as Khosrow named it, became a symbol of Persian cultural confidence, a demonstration that the Sassanid Empire could not only conquer Roman territories but improve upon Roman achievements. The relocated population, despite their involuntary exile, gradually adapted to Persian rule and became valuable assets to their new masters. Justinian's response to the loss of Antioch revealed both his strategic limitations and his political necessities. With Belisarius committed to the Italian campaign and imperial resources stretched thin by plague and rebellion, the emperor could not mount the kind of massive counteroffensive that the loss of such an important city normally would have demanded. Instead, he was forced to rely on diplomacy and bribery, offering tribute payments to Khosrow in return for peace along the eastern frontier. The eternal peace, concluded in 545, was eternal only in name, lasting less than a decade before warfare resumed with renewed intensity. Both empires used the interval to rebuild their military capabilities and strengthen their frontier defenses, understanding that the underlying strategic competition that drove their conflict had not been resolved by temporary agreements. The tribute payments that Rome made to Persia were particularly galling to imperial pride, transforming the Eastern Empire from Persian equal to Persian tributary. The resumption of full-scale warfare in 572 came during the reign of Justin II, Justinian's nephew and successor, who had refused to continue the tribute payments that his predecessor had agreed to pay. The new war demonstrated that both empires had learned from their previous conflicts, developing new tactical approaches and strategic concepts that reflected the changing nature of late antique warfare. Persian armies now included substantial numbers of mounted archers whose mobility and firepower gave them significant advantages over Roman infantry formations that had changed little since the time of Trajan. These horse archers, many of them recruited from the nomadic tribes of Central Asia, could devastate Roman formations from a distance while avoiding the close combat where Roman discipline and equipment might give them the advantage. The Romans responded by developing their own cavalry forces and by fortifying the frontier more systematically than ever before. The great fortress cities of Dara and Amida became anchors of a defensive system designed not to prevent Persian invasion but to channel it into killing grounds where Roman advantages in siege warfare and urban combat could be brought to bear. The frontier became a landscape of fortified cities connected by military roads that allowed rapid concentration of forces at threatened points. But the most significant development of this period was the emergence of proxy warfare, as both empires sought to avoid the enormous costs of direct confrontation by supporting client kingdoms and tribal confederations along their frontiers. In the Caucasus, Christian Georgia and Armenia became battlegrounds where Roman and Persian influence competed through local surrogates. In the Arabian Peninsula, Ghassanid Arabs allied with Rome while Lakhmid Arabs served Persian interests, their raids and counter-raids extending the great power competition into regions that had previously been marginal to imperial concerns. The burden of constant warfare along the eastern frontier fundamentally altered the character of the Eastern Empire. Military expenses consumed an ever larger portion of imperial revenues, while the need to maintain large standing armies changed the relationship between emperor and subjects. The civilian bureaucracy that had administered the empire since Diocletian's reforms was increasingly supplemented by military officials whose authority derived from their control over armed force rather than legal expertise or administrative skill. The psychological impact of the Persian Wars was perhaps even more significant than their material costs. For centuries, Romans had believed that their empire was destined to expand until it encompassed the entire civilized world, that Roman victory was guaranteed by divine providence and superior institutions. The Persian Wars demonstrated that this was no longer true, that Rome faced an enemy that was not only militarily capable but culturally sophisticated, an empire that could match Roman achievements in administration, architecture, and learning. This realization forced a fundamental re-examination of imperial ideology and strategy. The Eastern Empire would survive the Persian challenge and eventually triumph over it, but the cost would be enormous, and the empire that emerged from centuries of warfare would be very different from the confident, expanding power that Justinian had ruled at the height of his ambitions. In the year 610, as Heraclius fought desperately to save the Eastern Empire from Persian invasion and internal rebellion, an Arab merchant named Muhammad received what he believed to be his first revelation in a cave on Mount Hira, near the trading city of Mecca. The Byzantine court, preoccupied with existential threats from enemies they had fought for centuries, paid little attention to religious developments among the nomadic tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, tribes that seemed too poor and divided to pose any serious threat to civilized powers. This indifference would prove to be one of history's greatest miscalculations. Within a generation, the faith that Muhammad proclaimed would unite the Arabian tribes under a single banner and launch them on campaigns of conquest that would destroy the Persian Empire entirely and strip the Eastern Roman Empire of its wealthiest and most populous provinces, transforming the Mediterranean world in ways that would have seemed impossible to imagine when the century began. The Arabia that gave birth to Islam was a harsh land of deserts and oases, where Bedouin tribes lived by herding camels and conducting raids against their neighbors, while merchant cities like Mecca and Medina prospered by controlling the trade routes that connected the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. It was a society that had remained largely untouched by the great empires that surrounded it, too poor to be worth conquering and too fragmented to pose a threat to its powerful neighbors. But this apparent weakness concealed strengths that would prove decisive when the Arabs began their expansion beyond the peninsula. The harsh environment had produced warriors of exceptional endurance and mobility, men who could travel vast distances with minimal supplies and fight effectively in terrains that would defeat conventional armies. Their tribal organization, while politically fragmented, created bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation that could be extremely effective when united behind a common cause. Muhammad's message combined religious revelation with social reform and political organization in ways that addressed the specific needs and aspirations of Arabian society. The new faith demanded submission to Allah, but it also promised justice and equality among believers, offered clear rules for commercial and social relations, and provided a framework for uniting the fractious tribes under a single religious and political authority. The Prophet's death in 632 created a crisis of succession that threatened to fragment the Muslim community, but the emergence of the Caliphate as an institution provided both religious and political leadership that could direct the enormous energies that Islam had unleashed. Under the first four caliphs, known to later Muslim historians as the rightly guided, the Arab armies began the expansion that would make Islam one of the world's great religions and create an empire that stretched from Spain to India. The timing of the Islamic expansion was almost impossibly favorable for the Arabs and disastrous for their enemies. The Persian and Byzantine empires had exhausted themselves in a series of wars that had lasted from 602 to 628, leaving both powers financially ruined and militarily weakened. The populations of Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia had been ravaged by warfare, taxation, and religious persecution, making them potential allies rather than obstacles for Arab conquerors who promised lower taxes and religious tolerance. The first major confrontation between Arab and Byzantine forces came at the Battle of Ajnadayn in 634, where a Muslim army under Khalid ibn al-Walid defeated a larger Byzantine force and opened the road to Jerusalem. The battle revealed both the tactical superiority of Arab cavalry and the demoralization of Byzantine troops who no longer believed in the ultimate victory that had sustained Roman armies for centuries. Jerusalem fell to the Arabs in 638 after a siege that was notable for the restraint shown by the conquerors toward the city's Christian and Jewish populations. The Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab personally traveled to accept the city's surrender, and the terms he granted were far more generous than those typically offered by either Byzantine or Persian conquerors. Christians were permitted to keep their churches and practice their faith, Jews were allowed to return to a city from which they had been excluded by Christian emperors, and the Islamic conquest began to seem like liberation rather than catastrophe to many of the region's inhabitants. The fall of Damascus in 636 and the decisive Muslim victory at the Battle of Yarmouk that same year effectively ended Byzantine control over Syria, a province that had been Roman for 7 centuries. The wealth of Syrian cities, the productivity of Syrian agriculture, and the strategic importance of Syrian trade routes all passed into Muslim hands, providing the resources necessary for further expansion while simultaneously weakening the empire's capacity for resistance. Egypt, the empire's wealthiest province and the source of Constantinople's grain supply, fell to Arab armies in 642 after campaigns that demonstrated the inadequacy of Byzantine responses to this new type of warfare. The loss of Egypt was perhaps more devastating to the empire's long-term prospects than any previous territorial loss, since it removed not only vast agricultural wealth but also the manufacturing centers and commercial networks that had made the Eastern Empire economically viable. The speed and completeness of the Islamic conquests shocked contemporary observers and continue to puzzle historians today. How could armies emerging from one of the world's most backward regions defeat the sophisticated military establishments of the great powers so quickly and decisively? Part of the answer lay in Arab military advantages, their mobility, their motivation, their adaptation to desert warfare, but equally important was the weakness and demoralization of their enemies. The Byzantine Empire that faced the Islamic challenge was not the confident, expanding power that Justinian had ruled a century earlier. Plague, war, and religious controversy had sapped its strength, while theological disputes had alienated many of its subjects from the imperial government. The Monophysite Christians of Syria and Egypt often welcomed Arab conquerors who promised religious tolerance, seeing Muslim rule as preferable to continued persecution by Orthodox emperors. Perhaps most importantly, the Islamic conquests offered something that neither the Persian nor the Byzantine Empire could provide: a vision of universal brotherhood that transcended ethnic and social divisions. Arab, Persian, and Greek converts to Islam became equal members of a religious community that promised both spiritual salvation and material advancement to all who accepted its teachings and obligations. By 650, less than 20 years after Muhammad's death, the Islamic Empire controlled territories stretching from the Pyrenees to the Oxus River, an expansion more rapid than anything achieved by Alexander the Great or the early Roman Republic. The Byzantine Empire survived this onslaught, but it was transformed in the process, reduced from a universal empire to a regional power struggling to defend its remaining territories against enemies who possessed both superior numbers and unshakable religious conviction. In the year 726, Emperor Leo III stood before the great bronze doors of Hagia Sophia, his hand trembling slightly as he signed the edict that would tear the Byzantine Empire apart for more than a century. The morning light streaming through the church's windows illuminated walls covered with mosaics that had been the glory of Christian art for 2 centuries, Christ in majesty, the Virgin and Child, saints and angels whose golden faces had inspired the prayers of countless worshippers. Within months, many of these images would be destroyed by imperial order, their fragments swept away like the remnants of a faith that had lost its way. The theological controversy that erupted around the use of religious images, known as iconoclasm, reflected tensions that had been building within Byzantine Christianity since the empire's foundation. As Islam expanded across former Christian territories, Byzantine theologians struggled to understand why God had permitted such disasters to befall his chosen people. Some concluded that the empire had fallen into idolatry, that the veneration of icons had become a form of paganism that prevented God's favor from returning to the Christian empire. Leo III was a soldier emperor who had risen through military ranks during the desperate struggles against Arab expansion. He had witnessed the siege of Constantinople in 717 to 718, when Muslim armies had surrounded the capital and seemed on the verge of destroying the last remnant of the Roman Empire. The city's salvation through what appeared to be divine intervention had convinced him that God demanded purification of Christian worship, elimination of practices that might be construed as violations of the commandment against graven images. The emperor's decision to begin destroying religious images was not taken lightly or without precedent. Influential bishops, particularly those from Asia Minor where Islamic influence was strongest, had been arguing for years that icon veneration was theologically unsound and politically dangerous. They pointed out that Muslims regularly accused Christians of idolatry, that the success of Islamic armies might reflect divine disapproval of Christian practices that seemed to violate biblical teachings. But the implementation of iconoclastic policies revealed the depth of popular attachment to religious images and the political dangers of theological innovation imposed from above. When imperial agents arrived at churches to remove or destroy icons, they often faced resistance not only from clergy but from ordinary believers who saw the images as channels of divine grace rather than obstacles to proper worship. Women particularly opposed iconoclasm, perhaps because domestic religious practices had made them especially devoted to icons of the Virgin and Child. The monastery of Studios in Constantinople became a center of resistance to imperial iconoclastic policies, its abbot Theodore leading a movement that combined theological opposition with political resistance to imperial authority over religious matters. The monks argued that icons were not idols but windows into the heavenly realm, that their veneration honored the divine persons they represented rather than the materials from which they were made. More dangerously for imperial authority, they insisted that emperors had no right to determine theological truth independently of ecclesiastical guidance. The iconoclastic controversy created a crisis of authority that extended far beyond theological debate. If the emperor could be wrong about such fundamental religious questions, what other imperial policies might be illegitimate? If bishops and monks could resist imperial edicts on religious grounds, what prevented similar resistance to secular laws? The theological dispute became a constitutional crisis that challenged the Caesaropapist system that had governed church-state relations since Constantine. Popular resistance to iconoclasm was often violent and always passionate. Crowds rioted when imperial agents destroyed beloved icons, women formed human chains to protect churches from iconoclastic officials, and monks developed elaborate schemes to hide sacred images until more favorable times. The empire's religious unity, which had been a source of strength since the time of Justinian, fractured along lines that reflected not only theological differences but social and regional divisions. The iconoclastic policies also created diplomatic tensions with other Christian powers, particularly the papacy in Rome, which refused to accept imperial authority over such fundamental theological questions. Pope Gregory III condemned iconoclasm as heretical, creating a rift between Eastern and Western Christianity that would have lasting consequences for both imperial diplomacy and ecclesiastical unity. The papal rejection of iconoclasm encouraged resistance within the empire while providing ideological support for those who questioned imperial religious authority. Leo III's son Constantine V, who ruled from 741 to 775, proved even more zealous in enforcing iconoclastic policies than his father had been. Known to his enemies as Copronymus for allegedly defiling his baptismal font, Constantine combined theological sophistication with ruthless persecution of those who opposed his religious policies. His theological treatises against icon veneration were learned and systematic, but his methods of enforcement were often brutal and counterproductive. Under Constantine V, the destruction of religious art reached unprecedented levels. Mosaics that had adorned churches for centuries were chiseled from walls, manuscripts containing religious images were burned, and artists who had created devotional works found themselves branded as criminals. The cultural loss was staggering. Centuries of artistic achievement disappeared in decades of systematic destruction that impoverished the visual culture of Byzantine Christianity. The persecution of monks during Constantine V's reign revealed the political dimensions of the iconoclastic controversy. Monasteries were centers not only of icon veneration but of economic power and social influence that could challenge imperial authority. The emperor's attacks on monastic communities served multiple purposes: eliminating theological opposition, confiscating monastic wealth, and reducing the political influence of institutions that maintained some independence from imperial control. The Empress Irene, who served as regent for her son Constantine VI beginning in 780, began the gradual restoration of icon veneration that would eventually triumph over iconoclastic policies. Her decision to reverse imperial religious policy was motivated partly by genuine religious conviction but also by political calculation. Iconoclasm had proven divisive and unpopular, while its restoration promised to reunite the empire behind traditional practices that commanded widespread support. The Second Council of Nicaea in 787 formally condemned iconoclasm and restored the veneration of religious images, but the theological controversies continued to simmer beneath the surface of imperial politics. The council's decisions were not universally accepted, particularly among the military aristocracy of Asia Minor, where iconoclastic sentiment remained strong and where the threat of Islamic invasion made theological arguments about images seem less important than military effectiveness. The revival of iconoclasm under Leo V beginning in 815 demonstrated that the theological controversy was far from resolved and that imperial religious policy could shift dramatically with changes in imperial personnel. The second iconoclastic period, though less violent than the first, showed that the fundamental tensions between imperial authority and ecclesiastical independence, between theological innovation and traditional practice, between military necessity and religious conviction, had not been permanently resolved. The final triumph of icon veneration in 843, celebrated thereafter as the triumph of orthodoxy, marked more than the end of a theological controversy. It represented the victory of a particular vision of Byzantine Christianity that would shape the empire's culture and politics for centuries to come. The restored icons were not merely artistic objects but symbols of theological positions that had political implications, visual representations of beliefs about the nature of imperial authority, ecclesiastical independence, and the proper relationship between earthly and heavenly power. The iconoclastic crisis had lasting effects on Byzantine civilization that extended far beyond the immediate theological questions that had triggered the controversy. The destruction of so much religious art impoverished the empire's visual culture, while the theological debates had sharpened distinctions between Eastern and Western Christianity that would eventually contribute to the permanent schism between Greek and Latin churches. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis had demonstrated the limits of imperial authority over religious matters and the dangers of imposing theological innovation from above. The political consequences of iconoclasm were equally significant. The controversy had revealed deep divisions within Byzantine society, between military and civilian elites, between capital and provinces, between men and women, between monks and secular clergy, that future emperors would have to navigate carefully to maintain imperial unity and effectiveness. The morning mist rose from the Golden Horn on May 11, 1453, revealing the massive walls of Constantinople surrounded by the tents and siege engines of Mehmed II's Ottoman army. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos stood upon the ramparts that Theodosius II had built more than 1,000 years earlier, watching the final preparations for what everyone knew would be the last assault on the last remnant of the Roman Empire. Behind him lay a city that had once held 500,000 inhabitants but now sheltered perhaps 50,000 souls, while before him stretched an army of perhaps 150,000 men equipped with cannons that could breach walls that had protected the city since the 5th century. The empire that faced this final crisis bore little resemblance to the confident, expanding power that Justinian had ruled 9 centuries earlier. Stripped of its wealthiest provinces by Islamic conquest, weakened by centuries of civil war and foreign invasion, reduced to little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories in Greece and Asia Minor, Byzantium had become a shadow of its former glory, sustained more by the prestige of its imperial title than by actual power. Yet even in decline, the Byzantine Empire had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for survival and renewal that had enabled it to outlast the caliphate that had conquered its richest provinces, the Bulgarian Empire that had threatened its existence in the Balkans, and the crusading states that had been established on its former territories. Time and again, when the empire seemed on the verge of complete collapse, it had found the resources and leadership necessary to recover, adapt, and continue. The survival of Byzantium through a millennium of crises was partly due to the strength of the institutions that Constantine and his successors had created. The imperial bureaucracy proved remarkably adaptable, capable of functioning effectively even when imperial resources were severely reduced. The legal system provided continuity and legitimacy that could survive military defeats and territorial losses. The Church offered spiritual consolation and cultural identity that helped maintain imperial unity even when political unity seemed impossible. Perhaps more importantly, the empire's location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, which had been a source of strength during its expansion, continued to provide advantages even during its decline. Constantinople remained one of the world's great commercial cities, its markets attracting merchants from as far away as India and Britain. The customs duties collected on goods passing through the Bosphorus provided revenue that could support imperial administration and military forces far beyond what the empire's reduced territory could otherwise sustain. The cultural achievements of the later Byzantine Empire were in some ways more remarkable than those of its golden age, precisely because they were accomplished with such limited resources. The mosaics of Kurii Kamii, created in the 14th century when the empire controlled little more than Constantinople itself, represent some of the finest achievements in the history of Christian art. The theological and philosophical works of scholars like Gemistos Plethon helped preserve classical learning and transmit it to the Renaissance West at a time when the empire seemed politically moribund. The empire's military resilience was perhaps even more impressive than its cultural achievements. Despite facing enemies who possessed overwhelming numerical and resource advantages, Byzantine forces continued to fight effectively through superior organization, better training, and the kind of tactical flexibility that had characterized Roman armies since the days of the Republic. The last Byzantine emperors were often military commanders of considerable skill who could achieve remarkable results with minimal forces. The relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the emerging powers of Western Europe during the empire's final centuries revealed both the persistence of imperial prestige and the harsh realities of political weakness. Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa established commercial privileges in Byzantine territory that amounted to economic colonization, while Western rulers treated Byzantine emperors with a mixture of respect for their ancient dignity and contempt for their current powerlessness. The attempts to reunite the Greek and Latin churches, motivated primarily by Byzantine hopes of receiving Western military assistance against Islamic enemies, demonstrated the cultural gulf that had opened between Eastern and Western Christianity despite their common origins. The theological differences that had developed over centuries of separation proved impossible to bridge, while the political conditions that Western rulers attached to their offers of military aid were often more threatening to Byzantine independence than the enemies they were supposed to help repel. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th century presented the Byzantine Empire with its most formidable enemy since the early Islamic conquests. Unlike previous Muslim powers, which had been primarily Arab or Persian in character, the Ottomans were Turkish nomads who had combined Islamic religious zeal with the military traditions of the Central Asian steppes. Their expansion across Anatolia and into the Balkans systematically eliminated the remaining Byzantine territories and isolated Constantinople from any possibility of external assistance. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 was not merely a military operation but a symbolic confrontation between two civilizations, two concepts of empire, two understandings of the relationship between earthly and divine authority. Mehmed II saw himself as the heir to both Islamic and Roman imperial traditions, while Constantine XI represented the unbroken continuity of Roman authority that stretched back through more than 2 millennia to Augustus and the founders of the Republic. The final assault on Constantinople began before dawn on May 29, 1453, with Ottoman cannon pounding breaches in the Theodosian walls while waves of infantry attacked along the entire length of the land walls. Constantine XI died fighting on the walls, his purple regalia abandoned so that his body was never definitively identified among the thousands of defenders who perished in the final battle. His death marked the end not only of the Byzantine Empire but of the Roman Empire itself, the final extinction of an institution that had endured for over 1,500 years. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul, of Hagia Sophia into a mosque, of the last Roman emperor into an Ottoman sultan, represented more than a change of rulers, it marked the end of an entire phase of world history. The medieval world, which had been shaped by the interaction between Roman political institutions, Greek intellectual traditions, and Christian religious beliefs, gave way to an early modern world where Islamic empires, European nation-states, and global commercial networks would create new patterns of power and culture. Yet the legacy of Byzantium extended far beyond the political boundaries of the empire itself. The legal traditions codified in Justinian's law codes continued to influence European jurisprudence, while the theological and philosophical works of Byzantine scholars helped shape both Islamic thought and the European Renaissance. Most importantly, the Orthodox Christianity that had developed under Byzantine auspices survived the empire's fall to become the faith of millions of people from Russia to Ethiopia, from Romania to Georgia. The preservation of classical Greek literature and learning in Byzantine libraries and schools ensured that the intellectual achievements of ancient Greece would be available to later generations of scholars and students. Without Byzantine scribes and scholars, much of what we know about ancient philosophy, science, and literature would have been lost forever, making the empire's cultural contributions to human civilization as significant as its political and military achievements. As our journey through the centuries draws to a close, let your breathing slow and deepen, feeling the weight of history settle gently around you like a familiar blanket. We have walked through the corridors of the Great Palace, witnessed the construction of Hagia Sophia, stood with Belisarius on African beaches and watched the final siege of Constantinople. All of this vast sweep of time, all these emperors and generals, saints and scholars, now rest peacefully in the realm of memory. Feel yourself returning slowly to the present moment, to the comfort of your own bed, your own pillow. The Byzantine Empire endured for over 1,000 years, through plagues and invasions, through theological controversies and military defeats, because it possessed something that transcended any individual ruler or particular crisis, the capacity to adapt, to survive, to find meaning in continuity itself. Like the empire we have been exploring, you too possess this capacity for endurance and renewal. Tomorrow you will face your own challenges, make your own decisions, write your own small chapter in the continuing story of human civilization. But tonight, rest in the knowledge that you are part of something larger than yourself, connected to all those who came before and all who will come after. Let the golden dome of Hagia Sophia fade gently from your mind's eye. Feel the weight of centuries lifting from your shoulders as you sink deeper into sleep, carrying with you only the gentle echo of hymns sung in churches that no longer exist, the whisper of silk banners stirring in breezes that blew long ago, the peace that comes from knowing that all things, even empires, find their rest in time. Sleep now, and dream if you will of purple-robed emperors and golden mosaics, of ships sailing ancient seas toward harbors that welcome them home. The story continues, but for now, it continues without you, allowing you the deepest and most restorative sleep. Good night. If you're still awake, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which empire should we explore next? Sweet dreams.